Mr. Mark Kramer with Armand Bayou Nature Center. You know your exact title, Mark.
It's evolving.
Oh.
I'm now the Conservation Director and Chief Naturalist.
Oh, excellent.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So with all due respect, Mr. Mark Kramer.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. So good to be amongst y'all again. I see a lot of familiar faces from previous Envirothons. This is one of my favorite things of the year to do, is be an Envirothon participant. I think it's a very valuable program. I've often stated that I wish there was Envirothon when I was in high school, which there was not, and there were not very many of these types of activities or programs to engage young folks in the outdoors. So on behalf of the next generation, let me say thank you to all you people that are here this morning, going above and beyond the call to help make sure our students get a really rich and meaningful offering from you guys. My job at the Nature Center, many of you probably know, I'm essentially in charge of the land management, the wildlife management, and a fair amount of public education and environmental education, which is what we'll be doing today. I'm a native to the area. I grew up about 5 miles north of here. I started hanging around Armand Bayou before I was old enough to drive a car, so the place really has a lot of history and means a lot to me. So you're going to see a pretty significant snapshot of a long period of time of activities that have been happening at Armand Bayou Nature Center. And this program is one that's been going on for a number of years. The presentation, some of you may have heard long ago when I used to advertise it as our Vegas style show. And that's because it was a multimedia extravaganza. Back then that meant slide carousels and VCRs, and maybe some of you remember the clear laminates you could write on and look at up there. So it's evolved into what we hope is a better technology, what we hope. But sometimes the integration of all the stuff, we're going to be looking at a few digital media offerings that were produced by the U of H Clear Lake. Nature Center has a great partnership with the University of Houston Clear Lake. I work with the Environmental Institute. I work with the Digital Media Studies Department. So we're going to be taking a break about every 20 minutes to watch film strips. Did anybody watch film strips as a kid? Some of you might be old enough to remember when teachers really showed real film. So now we're going to be looking at some little digital video shorts to kind of break up my lecture and the monotony of me talking, and it'll give us a chance to ask questions along the way too. So just to kind of give you the overview of what's coming, we're going to have about an hour and a half or so together to visit. And what we're discussing are prairies today. All of your speakers are going to be talking about grasslands. So Armand Bayou Nature Center provides somewhat of a unique case study in coastal prairies. Coastal prairie preservation. We're going to be talking about how the Nature Center came to be. Everyone that's in this room that is going to be speaking after me understands the importance of real long-term preservation. And most of the other speakers work at places where we're sure that prairies are going to be around, hopefully in perpetuity. We're going to be talking about once land is preserved, what do you do with it? How do you restore it? How do you bring back those natives? And then in the really long arc of horizon, how do we manage them? So our case study will be about preservation, restoration, and management. So here's Armand Bayou Nature Center. You can see the red lines are the boundaries of our property. It's a large polygon to the left. That was our initial acquisition of 1,900 acres of land back in the mid-1970s. And you can see a smaller polygon to the right, about 640 acres donated by Exxon. So all total, we manage about 2,500 acres of land at the Nature Center. That makes us one of the largest urban wilderness areas in the country. So that's a term you don't hear frequently in the same concept, urban and wilderness. And most of the speakers in our room tonight are going to be talking in that context. Houston is a major metropolitan area in the United States, and increasingly these types of urban wilderness tracts are very important to us for a long list of reasons. But these 4 square miles that we manage are increasingly an island ecosystem. Texas is growing, Houston is growing, and as a result, these fragmented islands of habitat are increasing in importance as time goes by. We're going to time travel a little bit today. I don't know, would it be better with lower light? Do you guys need this much light? Let me try it here. Let's see if that's better. That is better. Thank you. This is an image of the Armand Bayou watershed from 1960, roughly the year I was born. So let's interact a little bit. You look at this picture of Armand Bayou, about the year I was born. What's your first thought when you see that picture?
Prairie.
Prairie? Well, figures from Tom Solomon.
Meandering waterway.
Meandering waterway. Most waterways in Houston don't meander now. They've been
patchy green and brown.
Patchy green and brown, yeah. Maybe different habitats, yeah.
Few buildings.
That's really what I'm fishing for. Not so long ago, when you look at the landscape, it's hard to find a human structure. It's hard to find. You can see some disturbance. This is the very first dirt turnings of the Johnson Space Center. That's why this picture was taken. But not so long ago, right here where we are in the third, fourth largest city in the country, nothing here. So dramatic changes have happened over time. Human population has exploded in the Houston-Harris County area. That's one thing I see. The other thing is true, you noticed, is you see this patchwork. These are really the representative ecosystems of the upper Texas Gulf Coast. One of you described it as a meandering waterway. Yes, we're the Bayou City. It's a meandering stream. It's a tidal stream. It's an estuary. There's also a coastal flatwoods forest, this dark green ribbon that lines the boundaries of the bayou. But as Tom said, what you also mostly see are these big brown patches. All of this coastal tallgrass prairie. So I mentioned this is a representative snapshot of what was historically the ecological view of the upper Texas Gulf Coast. Estuaries, forests, and grasslands. So remember 1960, remember we're going to time travel a little bit. So in just the blink of an eye, really, less than a human lifespan, look at what has happened. A tremendous transformation of the landscape. Most all of Harris County now is a human-built environment. Harris County, we probably know, is the most densely populated county in Texas. It's also the third most densely populated county in the country. So tremendous human population, explosive growth boom over a relatively short period of time has left very little valuable habitat in our area. And particularly beginning in the 60s and 70s, that growth boom exploded. Humans moved here. My parents moved here from South Louisiana looking for work along the ship channel. When all those industries were being built, great opportunities for employment. Johnson Space Center, jobs, people came. Houston, all of the downtown metropolitan area, lots of work. And that meant lots of home building. So if you're a local to the area and you see that intersection of Bay Area and Red Bluff Road on this map, you notice this plot map of streets to be developed. That's where Armand Bayou Nature Center is now. There was a development plan by Exxon's subsidiary, the Friendswood Development Company, to build all of this area out. But fortunately for us, and hopefully the next generation, there were a few early visionaries of the environmental movement. This is a fellow named Armand Bayou. He's kind of cut off down here at the bottom, but that's our namesake. Armand was the late curator of the Burke Baker Planetarium. He was one of the real visionaries of the early developing environmental movement in the Houston area. He was one of the founding members of the Audubon Society in our area. He's largely responsible for the Open Beaches Act in Texas. And he was trying to establish a parks department around Houston to preserve some of these last remaining tracts around our area. As an astronomer, he was headed out of town one night to view a comet traveling across town with all of his telescopes and optical equipment in the back seat when he had a flat tire. And the folks who stopped to help him with his flat tire turned out to be thieves, and they robbed and murdered Armand on the side of the freeway. So a tragic loss. He was a person who came on the television shows on Saturday mornings, on the Kitterick Show, the Cadet Dawn Show that I used to watch when I was this tall. He had small animals with him, and he would talk about the importance of preserving open space, not just for wildlife, but also for people to reconnect with nature. So many times I've thought, as these years have gone by, and at times as I have looked at this image and thought back at the young Mark Kramer, how teachers affect people, sometimes in ways you may not even know until many years later. I've often wondered, what influence did Armand have on those young children that were watching those TV programs? So we're doing good work here, and thank you guys again. I mean that with all sincerity. I love this program, and I appreciate all your efforts. Armand, after his passing, was memorialized by some of his closest colleagues and friends. This woman named Hanna Ginsberg, I have often thought, is what Armand Bayou should truly be named after. Armand was the 10,000-foot visionary. Hanna was the woman that raised $6.5 million to preserve the property. She had a reputation of not being able to be said no to, as in when the governor of Texas was forced to come to Bay Area Park to go for a boat ride. This is Governor Preston Smith. Hanna invited him. He had a chance to tour Armand Bayou in that time period. And she stood in front of him, those children that were about my age, holding the signs that read, "This land belongs to the past, the present, and the future generations." So fortunately for all of us, property was acquired, those funds were purchased, enabled us to purchase the property, and we became a nonprofit corporation in 1974 with a twofold mission statement. One is obvious: we manage some of the most beautifully preserved natural area in the Houston area. And the second is to provide opportunities for people to better understand local ecosystems. That's what we're doing at Envirothon, local ecosystems. And high schools and colleges do a great job in offering opportunities for global, larger systems, coral reefs, tropical rainforests. Those are all critically important habitats, but many school students today, I would wonder if you asked your class, raise your hand if you've ever heard the term coastal tallgrass prairie before. It'd be interesting to see the percentage of your students which have ever heard of that term, which is our ecological heritage here in the Houston area. So that's what me and Jaime and Andy and all of us in the room are trying to do, is to engage people with what's right in our own backyard, those local ecosystems. We're going to pan in for a little bit closer view here. Here's Armand Bayou Nature Center and our three ecosystems again. You can see the bayou, that meandering tidal stream. By the way, one of the few remaining unchannelized bayous in the Houston area. You can see this riparian hardwood forest lining its edges, an oak-elm complex. And you can see the grasslands, the prairies. So it's the convergence of these three ecosystems that really account for the great diversity of life that occurs here on the Gulf Coast. We have the sweet spot of climate. Although if you'd asked me that last week, I don't know if I would have said that or not. But really, when you watch the news and look at Boston, we might still say we're kind of in that sweet spot. Not too hot, not too cold, typically. And as a result, with this abundant rainfall that we have a diversity of life that occurs on the Texas coast, right here in the Houston area, that's hard to rival almost anywhere else in the country. And it's the coming together of these three systems, the bayou, the forest, and the prairie, that accounts for this rich diversity. We don't really have big iconic species. We don't have redwoods or sequoias. We definitely don't have topography. Generally, we describe the coastal plain as being flat and featureless. But this is what we have. We have an unrivaled number of bird species on the Texas coast. We have a tremendous amount of diversity in the plant community. So it's this richness of life that is what we should be engaging ourselves and our students with right here where we are. Okay, we've preserved the place. Now we're going to engage in what our real mission today is, which is coastal tallgrass prairie. Well, there's tall grass. It's about as tall as you, very appropriately named in that regard. Fortunately, it's not like the grass that grows in your backyard. I'm glad I don't have to mow this with the push mower because it would be quite a tall order. Typically, tall grasses are somewhere between 3 and 6 feet tall, just to give you kind of a rough estimate of how tall a tall grass prairie is. It's also appropriately named. Hanna, you see that map? Did you make that map?
A graphic designer made that.
Okay, beautiful. I thought I'd give a nod to Jaime and the Katy Prairie Conservancy, who generously donated the image to me. It's the first time I've had him in the audience when I've showed this map as part of my presentation, so thank you. Coastal prairies are appropriately named in the coastal adjective because you can see there's a thin margin right along the edge of the Gulf of Mexico that these prairies occur. Roughly about 50 miles in from the edge of the Gulf. That might be about the widest spot, maybe up to Conroe is what that looks like to me, maybe. So, coastal Texas, coastal tallgrass prairie. One of the things as coastal residents that we know is that we're moisture rich here on the Texas coast. And it's this coastal adjective in front of the tallgrass prairies that is a unique distinguishing feature because we get so much rain here. We average 48, 50 inches of rain every year. That's about twice what they get in Nebraska or Iowa or Kansas in those tallgrass prairies. Remember, we have tallgrass prairies in the interior of the continent. This is one of the distinguishing features of coastal prairies, is that the abundant rainfall means that our prairies have abundant rain and the wetland features that they create and abundant wetland prairie plants. So this thin margin running all the way down from Kingsville, Corpus Christi, all the way up to Lafayette, Louisiana, is the entire range of this coastal tallgrass prairie habitat. Well, we think about prairies, we define them as a plant community dominated by grasses. And that's true. If I asked you to close your eyes and imagine a prairie, it probably wouldn't look like that, would it? It'd probably be green. Because we think about prairies being grasslands, and that's true, but it turns out that prairies are really much more than just grasses. And as this image indicates, it's not just a diversity of plant life, it's incredibly beautiful plant life. So beginning in the early warming spring months, we begin to see an abundance of dramatically blooming wildflowers, such as these liatris. Those plants may have been dormant through the whole winter, no indication that they are surviving. They reemerge, they make these beautiful flowers, they set their seeds, they decline, they disappear, only to be replaced in the next few weeks by the next assembly and next set of those beautiful blooming flowers. And it's really only been in the past few years that we've begun to recognize as prairie ecologists what this diversity means for diversity in the animal community of grasslands, particularly with insects. And those of you that have studied prairies over the past few years, you probably know that there's an increasing emphasis on many of those pollinators and other plants that are a critical element in grassland ecology, particularly for those that migrate, like the monarch butterfly. These nectar-producing plants are of critical importance as food resources and host plants to many of those insects that live in these grasslands and migrate. So our ecological heritage, if we go back in time, remember I said we're going to time travel a fair amount in our discussion today. We chose to build our houses and townships overlooking these beautiful areas. Pull out a Texas map. See if you can find Prairie View or Grand View or Longview or many of those Texas township names that were built right on the edge of these huge expanses. And huge they were, as in often those early westward expansions, as people were traveling through their prairie schooners, schooner like being a boat at sea, that was very much what like the experience was as they headed west, encountered these types of landscapes from horizon to horizon. They would see waves of grass blowing in the wind. They would leave town and they would say they had lost sight of land when they could no longer see trees or houses. They would often circumvent big circles to recover their own tracks as time passed, as if they had been lost at sea. So when we say prairies were important to us historically, this is part of the reason. They are a big part of Texas and American history. Here's a picture of George's elbow. Our prairies generally grow on a particular type of soil. Oftentimes it's these clayey soils that grasslands prefer to live on. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those prairie soil characteristics. One of the things that is most interesting about these clayey soils, and I use that word clayey, I hope all of you know when I say that I'm meaning those very fine soil particles, almost like you're erasing chalk off of the chalkboard and the dust is so fine. Our clayey prairie soils are very small soil particles, and they have a peculiar behavior. Soils that move. So that movement and that behavior of soils are driven by our seasonal soil moisture cycle. That's something maybe you've not contemplated, but here in Texas we have a soil dry season and a soil wet season. And it's not like clockwork, but we know that it happens seasonally. What time of the year do you think this picture was taken?
Summer.
Yeah, most of us intuitively know that. June, July, August, usually September. The sun is bright, it's hot, the temperatures are in the upper 90s. There's a lot of evaporation of water coming out of the soil. These plants are green and growing, so the physiology pulls the moisture out through evapotranspiration. It goes off into the atmosphere. And when that happens, these soils have this behavior of shrinking. And in fact, shrinking to the point that they often produce these big cracks in the soil. That's why they're referred to as shrink-swell soils, and that behavior follows the seasonal soil moisture pattern. It's dry in the summer. In the winter, it begins to change. Typically, we get our first cool fronts about October. We were talking about the abundant rainfall here. Those cool fronts come across North America. They collide with the Gulf moisture. They bring rainfall and cooling temperatures. The plants become dormant. As a result, that evapotranspiration no longer happening. And usually about October, November, these soils begin to change. They get more moisture rich. And the opposite of the shrinking and cracking occurs. They actually begin to swell shut. This is one of the driest periods that Houston has ever encountered. I said, George, stick your arm all the way down there, but he wouldn't do that. I don't know if he was afraid of something down at the bottom of that crack or not. But this was 2011. This was the big drought. So those were about as big a cracks as we have ever seen in the Armand Bayou Prairie. But October, November, this all begins to change. Now those soils swell shut. And because those soil particles are so small, they compress together very tightly. And essentially what that means is that those waters don't percolate downward very well. In fact, clay soils, moist clay soils, have very little lateral transference very deep once they're swollen shut. And we describe this type of scenario as the soils being supersaturated. Supersaturated means water standing on top of the ground. And you remember we talked about the moisture-rich environment producing all the abundance of these prairie wetlands, sometimes called prairie pothole features. So scattered throughout the Armand Bayou prairies is an abundance of these. Probably you guys as school teachers teach a significant list of wetland values and functions, I hope. So one of the values of these is that it's important habitat for wildlife. Many of our most important amphibians, frogs and toads in particular, use these wetlands as reproductive habitat. We know that. Amphibians lay their eggs in water. But it turns out that these wetlands are only here for a short amount of time. Ephemeral wetlands. Here today, gone tomorrow. So whenever there's a big rain, and whenever these ponds fill up overnight, there is a frog party at Armand Bayou like you would not believe, because you have got to get the getting while the water is good so that your babies will have time for the tadpoles to metamorphosize before the pond dries up. But it also turns out that that's an important element. The ephemeral nature of this means there are very few established fish populations in these ephemeral ponds. No fish means fewer predation of your offspring. So it almost seems like it's a beautifully meshed cycle, doesn't it? Almost. So these things generally occur as the cool fronts come, seasonally. We can depend on these prairie wetlands being more moist and more supersaturated from October until April or May. Just kind of depends on how the seasonality unfolds. These wetlands also play a critical role in Galveston Bay's water quality. So we're going to go back in time again. We're going to imagine that 1960 image. Remember that picture? Imagine 10,000 of these prairie wetland features scattered throughout that. Imagine we have a 4-inch rain event. Those waters are flowing across the prairie landscape. They have a residence time. They're held in these prairie wetlands. The water in this wetland has a chance for those sediments to settle, for nutrients to be absorbed, for toxins to be absorbed in the prairie plant community, and then it's slowly released back into the bayous in Galveston Bay, improving the water quality, improving the health of the life and the seafood that I like to eat that comes out of there. But that same abundance of wetlands also has green infrastructure value. That's a term increasingly we're trying to use more and more, especially for these types of open spaces in urban areas. These natural areas and these wetlands provide a great buffer against flooding. So we have that type of scenario here. If we had had that 10,000 wetlands in the prairies of 1960, they would have had this retention value as those big rain events transpired. Rain events. Let's headline event, because in Houston, that's one thing we have. We have rain, but we also have rain events. So we know that we're having a rain event in Houston. You wake up in the morning, it's been raining since midnight. You're kind of getting out of bed and you're thinking, oh man, can I make it to work? And you don't know. So you turn the TV on, and the weatherman's saying, we're going to get another 8 to 10 inches today. It's a big deal. We used to think that was a big deal, and then Harvey came. Turns out it might have been in an hour you might have gotten 8 or 10 inches. But a rain event often is characterized by the fact that the news doesn't go off all day. That's a good indicator to you we're having a rain event. So let's do a thought experiment. I'm going to walk you guys through a rain event in the Armand Bayou watershed. You can see Armand Bayou here. It winds its way up. These are the woodlands that line the edges. These are the prairies. Let's say that there's 50,000 wetlands scattered throughout those prairies, say the size of this room. We're having a rain event. We've had 3 inches of rain. It's falling on the landscape. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but we've decided to stay home. Those rains are kind of slowly being captured by the leaf surfaces of the grass. It's falling on the land. Another hour goes by. We have another 3 inches. Now it's kind of starting to pool in those wetlands, just like the picture that I showed you previously. Hours are going by. David Paul is still on the television. He's saying, I don't know, Mark. I really think you guys need to hunker down. And I'm with him. So I'm just staying there and I'm watching the rain totals stack up. Let's say another 3, 4, 5 inches have happened. And now the waters are beginning to sheet flow across the prairie into Armand Bayou. That's a term we use when the runoff is going across a flat landscape and just flowing like a sheet would, traveling across the landscape. The bayou's beginning to rise now. We've got the makings of maybe a bayou flood event. So right now we've had 6, 7 inches of rain. Bayou's coming up. David says, man, I think we're going to get another 10 inches. So now I'm really wondering, because the boathouse is down here, the pontoon boat is down here. Is it going to float through the roof? How high will the water get? It's what we always ask during a rain event. So as we have this 10-inch rain event, the waters have now escaped Armand Bayou. It's coming out on both sides. We've got a full-blown bayou flood event. It's happening in Buffalo Bayou, White Oak, Sims. They're all flooding. It's happening on Armand Bayou. But the water has been traveling across this landscape, and one of the features of moving water is erosion. Picks up sediments, picks up dirt as it's traveling. So remember, we've talked about clayey particles, tiny dust particles. We've talked about sand particles, large particles like sugar grains. All that stuff's been churned up. We're looking at the bayou, it looks like chocolate milk because of all that sediment that's been churned up in the bayou. And that water is now spreading out. It's flooding. It's escaped the bayou banks. Which of those sediments do you think settle out first, closest to the bayou? I hear a lot of mumbling.
The heavier sand.
Yeah, the heavier sand, that's right. So notice where these sands have been distributed, notice what plant community is largely growing there. It's mostly forests, it's mostly trees. Turns out that many of these tree species find that a much more desirable habitat. So this riparian, that word meaning a plant community that follows a waterway, that kind of follows this historic flood regime distribution of where the sandy soils, and that is where bayou soils are most sandy often, is right next to the bayou. But let's say that we're having a Harvey-style flood. We've talked about Vegas-style events. Let's go Harvey-style for a minute. What if we had 50 inches of rain? We'd say, wow, that never happens. We've never heard of that. Well, and it turns out that that's not true. It turns out that Claudette, back in 1979, we had a flood in Alvin, Texas, where we had 42 inches in one day, not in 4 days. So we know that in a human lifetime we can get huge floods, waters that may be really spread out. But what about geologic time compared to us as little minuscule pipsqueaks on the geologic time scale? What kind of floods might we have over, say, a 500-year period instead of a 100-year period, or a 5,000-year period? So we know that we've had flood events that were wildly more catastrophic than what we have experienced in our little pipsqueak lives. And as that happens, and these floodwaters really swing wilder and wider, those clayey soils are distributed in other wider parts, which is where the grasslands are distributed here. So a little bit of a thought experiment about soils, how they support the prairie plant communities, how they have been distributed over time because of the flood events that we have here. Another important exercise to do here, before we get too much further down the road, is to talk about human impacts to those floodings too. Because these wetland features in this image before development, where we had 10,000 wetlands in this prairie, when those flood events happen, those little scattered thousands of wetland features function as cumulative support of rainfall detention. Rainfall detention. We're now creating these big detention basins. That's good. It's better than channelizing, for sure. But if we could go back in time, before Houston had been covered with rooftops, roadways, parking lots, impermeable surfaces, before that, in this image, the wetlands were doing their jobs. The water was captured and slowly released back into the bayou. Today, however, remember that today image where everything is a human-built environment. When the water hits those impermeable surfaces, it's very quickly ushered back into the bayou. And so we have this big pulse event in the bayou where the waters go into the bayou quickly. The waters are no longer held and slowly released. The waters rise rapidly and they get into our homes. It's one of the problems. In addition to the fact that we've chosen to build our houses right beside the banks of those flood zones. All right. Questions? We're going to take a 2-minute breather and we're going to watch a film strip. Okay, let's watch. Welcome to the Bayou City Eco Almanac, and today we're talking about flooding. I'm standing in a forested wetland, and these types of wetland areas help to mitigate and buffer big flood events that are created by rainfall events. These types of areas help to capture those rainfalls and then slowly release them into the bayous.
go back in time and view Harris County several hundred years ago, our landscape in this area would have been filled with these types of forested wetlands and prairie wetlands. And it turns out that today, over 30,000 acres of these types of prairie pothole wetlands and forested wetlands, which are behind us, have been destroyed in the process of our developing Harris County. When we have a major rain event and those waters are flowing down, they are very quickly ushered off of those impermeable surfaces, which often escapes the bayou edges and enters our homes. So very important to protect and preserve these types of remaining natural areas in the wetlands they contain, which benefit us.
Thanks to the digital media department at U of H Clear Lake. You've not seen any of those, have you, Wendy? You have? Oh, we posted these, didn't we? Have you guys watched these already? Is that? Raise your hand if it, okay. Because Wendy's posted these, I think. Tell us what you've done, Wendy.
What have we done, Debbie?
I don't think I've seen that one. There are a couple
Okay.
on there, but I don't think this one's on there.
But it is
It's a YouTube. They're on the Nature Center website for sure. And there is a video gallery link on the Nature Center website. And there are probably 30 of these of differing content on the video gallery at the Nature Center website. And I speak to a lot of high school and college groups, and I have found that it's a nice break and pause in the lecture program. So use them, please. Okay, the seasonality of prairies. We've talked about the seasonal soil moisture pattern. We've talked about summers being dry, winters being wet. What begins in November or so, roughly around the first frost date, and here in our area, that first frost is usually around Thanksgiving, somewhere around that time. Could be a week or two either side of that. As the seasons change and it gets cold, these prairie plant communities' character changes significantly. We looked at a green prairie earlier. Notice the difference in color here. This is a brown prairie. What that means is that the prairie plant community is becoming dormant. Very little active growth in the prairie plant community during the winter. In fact, almost all of the living tissue of the prairie plant community retreats below the soil surface in the winter months. Almost all of this is dead, dormant thatch. Last year's growth that has now died above the soil surface. So we might have 4 to 6 feet of foliage of those grasses and wildflowers above the surface, but below the surface, oftentimes we find 15, 20, 30 feet even of root mass that's growing underground. So the real action is underground. Prairies are oftentimes referred to as upside-down plant communities for that reason. Most of the biomass is below, and much of that is can be visualized by us thinking about building sod houses. You can think about that westward expansion, and as we moved our schooners westward, we dug bricks of this root mass, and it was dense enough for us to build homes out of those sod bricks that we dug out of the prairies as we had headed west. The other important feature of dormant dead thatch is because there's no physiology, there's no active growth during these winter months, it means that these are very dry grasses. So they become important fuel for prairie fires. Oftentimes it's easy for these prairies to burn during the winter months because if this grass were green, a lot of moisture in the stems and leaves, much more difficult for fire to pass across the prairie landscape. And we've heard over time in American history classes, in ecology classes, grasslands all around the world are often referred to as fire-dependent ecosystems. So I think we could debate if they're actually dependent. Some of our best prairies in Texas probably haven't burned in 50 years. That's a debate for a different time. But what we know is that these dry grasses carry fire more prevalently when they're dry and dormant in the wintertime. So the changing season. Well, it's hard to imagine that what was once our most common ecosystem, our ecological heritage in the Houston area, today has become one of the most critically imperiled ecosystems in North America. Most experts estimate less than 1% of these coastal prairies still survive. So that's a potent statistic. That's a noteworthy statistic. I'll say it in reverse. 99% of prairies have disappeared. That's a big deal. And it kind of begs the question, where have they gone? Where have all the prairies gone? And to understand that, again, we have to time travel a little bit. Let's go back in time to when there were 60 million bison in North America. That's one of several estimates of, at their peak, what we think the head count of the largest land animal in North America. Females about 1,500 pounds, males about 2,000 pounds. 60 million of these grazing animals. This is a picture of bison doing what they do best. They eat a lot of grass. And it's hard for us now to go back in time and imagine what those herds really look like. The sizes of the herds that once occupied North America. There's a really good book. I didn't bring it. I meant to. But it's called The Buffalo Book. We call these animals buffalo. Biologically, that's not correct. Culturally, it's what we call them, so it's probably okay, either term, buffalo or bison. But the Buffalo Book is like a historic anthology of the ecology of bison, of their demise and what happened, of the critical role that they played in the ecosystem. But one of the most striking narratives in that book is an account of a small army battalion heading across the prairie, coming up on a bluff, and seeing a herd of bison that they estimate with the binoculars is 20 miles wide and 50 miles long. And at the end of the sentence, the observer says, we estimate we have 2 counties of bison in view. 2 counties of bison in view. So for our kind of visualization, let's say we have a Harris County size herd of bison. Just let that soak in for a minute. Imagine that you're in the car on I-45. We're driving over the Galveston Causeway. We're going to drive at 60 miles an hour to Conroe, or wherever it is up there that Harris County ends. Where is it?
Spring Creek.
Spring Creek. There we go. Okay. 40 minutes, 50 minutes, I don't know. Driving at highway speed. Imagine that 20 miles, 10 miles on either side of you is this herd of grazing animals. So staggers the imagination by today's standards to try to visualize a herd of animals these size grazing across the open prairie. They're often referred to as a keystone species. You guys that teach biology probably are aware of that term. That means that this animal plays such a critical role in its environment that if it disappears, there is significant change in the environment once it's gone. That change that they brought about were these grazing effects. So you might imagine this Harris County size herd of bison is grazing across the open prairie. These are the leading edge animals. Let's say I'm at the front edge of the Harris County size herd of bison and we're moving across the prairie eating grass. Well, one of the interesting features is grazing animals have preference plants. That means that some of those grasses taste better than others. Just like me in front of the refrigerator door, that chocolate ice cream is just staring at me. And if I've really got to kind of not eat it first every time. But the preference plants for these animals oftentimes were what are referred to as ice cream plants by cowboys. And it turns out that those sugar-rich, easy to chew, highly palatable, protein-rich grasses were some of our most common grasses back in time. Eastern gamagrass, switchgrass, Indian grass, big blue stem. Those are preference plants in the grazing regime of these moving bison as they traveled across the landscape. But let's just imagine now we're at the back end. Let's say you're the last animal at that Harris County size herd of bison moving across the landscape. What do you think's left? It ain't the good stuff. So you're eating twigs and stems and much more less desirable material, but if you don't eat it, the alternative is you get nothing. So this is what ecologists refer to as a high-intensity grazing strategy. But remember, we're always looking for greener pastures. It's high intensity, but the prairie behind us now has a chance to rest. So it's a high-intensity, low-frequency grazing strategy. Those two terms are important for the recovery of grasslands, and very different, by the way, than what happened when we moved here as settlers, built permanent pastures with barbed wire fence, put our cattle inside of that same 20-acre paddock for perpetuity. The first month, our cattle went to that gamma grass, went to that switchgrass, and ate it. And every time a new 3 inches of it would reemerge, I'd go right back to it because I'd know where it is. It's sweet, it tastes good. But it turns out that plants require that rest period. They need to photosynthesize. They need to be able to do what plants do, store sugars in their starches and their roots. And when they can't, that's what we refer to as overgrazing. And oftentimes, those ice cream plants were some of the first to disappear in prairie habitats as those overgrazing strategies took place as we began to colonize all of North America. Okay, let me remind you, our question is, where have all the prairies gone? Well, that is an image of a mountain of buffalo skulls. Maybe you've seen this. This is a real popularized image. I got this out of National Geographic. So that 60 million population, because of overhunting pressure, plummeted down to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 animals. It's our best estimate. So where have all the prairies gone begins with the story of when the keystone species disappears, prairies begin to change. The second element of historic reference of where have all the prairies gone has to do with fire. We know that grasslands evolved in the presence of fire. We know that in the early days, these fires were ignited by lightning strikes. Bolt of lightning would hit the prairie, it would ignite it on fire, it would travel for great distances. We don't know how long, hundreds of miles, weeks. We just saw a fire in California burn for weeks. It's a little bit different fuel environment in California than here. But what we know is these fires, once they're going, they can really burn with great intensity and over a great part of the landscape until they hit a natural fire break. Now, I've been giving this talk a long time, and I used to say when a fire would hit a natural fire break, like a major river system, because until we had that drought of 2011, we didn't know that certain fuel conditions could actually have fires jump across major rivers. But that fire in Bastrop, Texas, it jumped across the Colorado River. So it may have been more meteorological patterns. It may have been rainfall events that would put fires like this out. But what we know is in the early days, they were ignited by lightning. They burned for great distances. And the prairie plant community evolved in the presence of these types of disturbance events. I say in the early days, that's before humans in North America. This is an excavation at Armand Bayou Nature Center of some of the native peoples that live here. We had a group of people on this side of Galveston Bay called the Arcokesis. There's a burial site at the southern end of Armand Bayou. This was a U of H Clear Lake excavation that was done there back in the 1970s. I show you this image because when humans moved across the land bridge into North America, the fire frequency increased. So bolts of lightning, they ignite prairies every now and then, but once people came here, we're tool users. Fire may be our most important tool. If not, it's one of the most important. And when the Indians came to North America, they began to shape the landscape with the use of fire by burning the environments with greater frequency than initially the lightning strikes would have. That increased frequency meant that the plant communities had to adapt. Fire can be very destructive. So what we know is that as they came here, these Arcokesis, a nomadic tribe that moved along Galveston Bay and Gulf of Mexico following a seasonal food supply. Imagine I'm the chief and I say we're going to walk to Galveston Island through coastal tallgrass prairie today. That's a tough go. It's a tough haul. It's a hard walk. So oftentimes native peoples would burn prairies to ease their migration routes. They also recognized that post-burn environment, that new tender green grass growth, very tender, very palatable to bison and deer and other game animals. So instead of us having to chase the animals, let's just have them come to us. Let's burn the prairie. It makes it that much easier. So the fire frequency increased for 10,000 years or so after humans moved into North America. And now, as we humans have overpopulated and urbanized the area, we, for many years, say fire is bad. So now we have been suppressing those fires, and that fire frequency and fire regime all across the United States for many decades almost completely stopped with the Smokey the Bear campaign and the other campaigns. So we're going to talk a little more about fire as a tool for us today as we get a little bit further into our discussion. But right now, we're talking about where have all the prairies gone. We have talked about the loss of the bison. We've talked about the importance of fire and how now those fires have been suppressed in North America. Where have all the prairies gone? This is a terrible picture of a Chinese tallow tree. If you squint your eyes, it might get a little bit cleaner for you. I will bet you everyone in the room is familiar with the term invasive species. And this is enemy number one in coastal prairies. At least over the past number of decades, tallows were brought here as a landscape plant. They were distributed widely in our subdivisions. They grow fast. They have beautiful fall color. They grow in clayey soil, sandy soil, salty soil. They grow anywhere, and you can try your best, but you're going to have to keep trying to kill a Chinese tallow tree because they're very resilient. These highly invasive plants that rank high on the threat list of invasive species have this list of adaptive strategies. I mentioned them a little bit. This plant grows anywhere. You can cut it down at the tree trunk and it will resprout with multiple stems. This adult tree makes about 10,000 seeds per year. Those seeds live about a decade once they hit in the ground, somewhere between 7 and 10 years in the ground. That's a list of adaptive strategies. And that list is one of the reasons they're so highly successful in out-competing all of the native plants that surround them. Yes?
So we're starting to see them up in the Dallas area now, too. In the creekways that I've grown up there as a kid, all the creekways now that I play in and take my kids in, we're starting to see them pop up.
And what do you think that they're just a new arrival, or do you think it's getting warmer, or what do you think?
I have seen one in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
If you're kicking out, those 100,000 seeds and
okay.
That long, they may have been there for a while and then finally found the right conditions as well.
It's possible.
A lot of them are on the right on the edge of where it's been kind of clear cut, and you have that hard kind of ecotone there. Well,
they are real specialists in disturbed areas. So if you're talking about a clear cut area or someplace that's been disturbed, that is definitely an opportunity for invasive species to colonize.
They're in my riparian area, east of San Antonio, by the Small Creek.
Mm-hmm.
It's outflow, and we've got them there. I've been asking to take them out.
Well, there are a very short list of plants that are illegal to transport and sell in Texas, and that is one of them. So you guys, I'm hearing you say in your neighborhood it might have been brought in just as food for thought. It is a bad enough problem that it has reached that status of not being legal to sell in Texas.
How long have those restrictions been in effect?
Oh,
People used to buy those.
they did used to buy them. I'm going to guess, and Andy or Jaime might know, but I think it's probably been about 8 or 10 years that it's been illegal to sell a tallow. Something like that.
Because they're so pretty in the fall.
Yeah.
All of your native honey around here, sold around here, is started as Chinese tallow flowers.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that we minimized beekeepers on our property. Is if you Google search it, Chinese tallow pollen is ranked number 3 on the 3rd most important pollen producers for honey in Texas. Okay, so we're talking about how those lists of adaptive strategies enable those plants to outcompete their neighbors. Outcompete. Plants competing. There's a term you don't think about very often, because here's a high energy, exciting picture of plants competing. Doesn't look like the NBA Finals, does it? Turns out it happens in slow motion over a long period of time in this prairie. And so you say, wait a minute, that's not a prairie. And I say, look down here at the grass. Look at the bushy blue stem, little blue stem. You can see remnant members of the prairie plant community, but your eye was drawn to the Chinese tallow tree in the front and center. I'm going to experiment. I wondered if we had a pointer on this. Well, we'll use this. We've got the Chinese tallow tree, we've got yaupons, we've got red oaks. What we have is a plant competition picture between woody species, trees and shrubs, versus the prairie plant community down here in the bottom. So this is a prairie image of plant competition, mostly for sunlight, in a prairie that has not been grazed, has not had those effects of bison. It's not been burned. It's not had the influence of the conservation director at Armand Bayou Nature Center. In the natural progression of this competition, as time goes by, as trees and shrubs grow taller, what happens is that what was once one of the most diverse plant communities in North America, these coastal prairie habitats, some of the literature will tell you as many as 1,000 species might occur in a coastal tallgrass prairie. I don't think we've found that yet in Texas, but the Deer Park Prairie has about 300 species in it. One of the most diverse prairie plant communities, because of this competition, has been literally transformed into a monoculture, a single species of non-native, highly invasive plants, the Chinese tallow tree. Trees grow tall, they harvest the sunlight up above the ground level of the prairie plants, and in essence, it is a biological desert by comparison. Where have all the prairies gone? Invasive species. In our area, increasingly, the prairies are disappearing because they're valuable habitat. They're valuable real estate. This real estate and development is transforming the landscape from those very rare areas into our businesses, industries, and homes. So the beginning now of our conversation is restoration. We've kind of set the stage of where they've gone. What are the impacts? What have happened to the prairies? Let's talk a little bit now about what we've done at Armand Bayou Nature Center. In the beginning, back in the 70s, we wanted Mother Nature to do her own thing. And we thought and hoped that if we could purchase, preserve, and just build a fence around the place, Mother Nature would do it all. But as we've seen over time, because of the changes that have happened in prairie landscapes, they can't really take care of themselves as they have historically. So we began to work with a restoration project. It's a term that was kind of newly being used in the late 80s and early 90s, restoration ecology. That part of science that seeks to bring back the natives, the native plants, the native animals, and of equal importance, bringing back those historic ecological influences, the influences that bison brought, the influences that fire brought. So we had a number of partners trying to deal with this type of restoration project. When we talk about restoration in this context, we talk about a human action. Restoration is always something that we do to enhance the landscape's value ecologically. And hopefully we do it in a thoughtful way. We make a plan. Nature Center has a natural resource management plan. Most big managed areas have a management plan. Ours is available on the website. Very useful tool for us to talk and plan and track what we've done. And it turns out that that plan helps us solicit funding. It's hard to do that type of work on a 4 square mile area or at all of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department's parks without funding. And with that funding, hopefully we can buy the tools, hire the people, and do what we need to do to manage these large-scale areas. So this first project that we undertook involved controlling Chinese tallows. But we're really gardening at the landscape level here. You guys have a garden out the back door. It's several thousand square feet. So you're gardening. There's a nice little prairie right out the back here. It's never looked better. And what we're doing is just what Wendy's doing. Just turns out it's over 4 square miles. So we're doing all the same stuff. We're having to manage invasive species. In this area of managing at the landscape level, we had to make a difficult choice. And that was to use chemicals in a wide scale to kill Chinese tallow trees. It was particularly tough because the people I was working with, we grew up and went to school and studied the problems with chemicals in the environment. Silent spring, DDT, big problems that had been created throughout the environment. So this was not an easy choice for us to do, but we had to recognize if we didn't do something significant, all of that prairie diversity was going to be lost to this invasion of Chinese tallow trees. So we sprayed 300 acres of Chinese tallows in this part of Armand Bayou Nature Center. And those trees began to die. This is a picture of 1995 or 6 when we did those sprayings. One of the things that you notice is they're beginning to die. You can see dead trees up above the young stewardship coordinator in that picture. But remember the list of adaptive strategies? So remember 10,000 seeds per tree? These are tallow seedlings. They're all coming back up underneath my feet. Somebody once said, "Is that a picture of the world's greatest tallow farmer?" So it turns out that restoration is an arc in time towards the horizon. It turns out there's not a silver bullet. It turns out there's not a one-time treatment. It turns out that it takes a significant ongoing effort to have success in prairie restoration and management. We followed up this initial application with a heavy-duty chipper, a chipping machine called a seppi. It's like a big lawnmower that can turn those big Chinese tallow trees into wood chips. So we've added on top of a chemical stressor, a mechanical stressor. And that's what we're doing, is adding layer and layer of stressors to this invasive species as part of an integrated pest management approach to try to have success in managing tallow populations. And this was also a difficult time. Late 1990s, cell phones first beginning to come into use. People driving around the perimeter of the Nature Center, chopping all the trees down at Armand Bayou Nature Center. So the phone would ring at the front desk. The woman would say, "Oh, that's Mark Kramer doing that. Let me connect you to him. He can tell you why we're cutting all the trees down." Yes?
What organisms have actually flourished because of the tallow being there, other than some of the pollinators? Have there been some things that were like, oh, this is one thing that we really like seeing around here, but because we're clearing this out, they're going to start moving away as well?
Well, not initially. And the reason is that this is a bed of about 3 to 6 inch wood chips. So it's a relatively sterile environment. There's not a lot there. Fungus, that type of decomposers flourished, but as far as wildlife, insect populations...
Within the tallow forest? Within it, not after the cutting, but within the...
Are we talking about up here or down here?
Up there within the forest that's developed.
Now, that's one of the unique features about how sterile tallow environments are. One of those adaptive strategies that I omitted is the fact that they exude a toxic sap. And that means there is very little predation of the insect community, animal community, very few things eat them. So no, we actually had a Rice University insect diversity PhD student contrast tallow forests versus grasslands back in probably about 2000. So it's a very, when we use the term monoculture, it's not exactly true, but it's pretty close to it. Not much else lives there. Yes?
Do they affect the bird community as well?
Do tallows affect the bird community? Yeah. Lots of birds eat those seeds. Hate those birds. But they transport the seeds around. So they do provide a food source to robins and many other songbirds. Woodpeckers eat those bird seeds. They get the name because the coating of that seed has a lipid coat to it. It's fat rich. So
it's not toxic to the birds.
But there's also the problem with the tallows taking over the coastal prairie. You don't have these islands of oaks that the migrants are focused on. For neotropical migrants, this is death. because there's nothing living on there. There's no insects that's living on them now, so they are not.
Yeah, they look park perfect. Nothing eats the leaves. They look park perfect. They're in especially this. There's nothing on them. You can see them. It's really weird. All their leaves are perfect. They look beautiful next to the native trees because there's nothing on them. So they give me the creeps.
Mark, is something in China in their native range that eats them?
Well, to some extent, the research that's been done is that in many areas people control them manually. There's a lot of people in China. And beyond that, I don't really have that answer. I don't know exactly what keeps them in check there. I'll ask our distinguished other guests if there's thoughts on that.
There is a bug, and actually in China, you almost have to grow these because they don't do real well in the wild. Because there's so many things that eat them. They evolve, all plants and insects, coevolution of plants and insects is very tight. But we're talking about introducing a bug now that kills Chinese tallow. But it was Kathy Bruce, I think, also looked at tallow, and she found that for the most part, the energy flow is between the tallow and pill bugs. Pill bugs would decompose the leaves. Pill bugs are also introduced. So you had a very short food web entirely composed of introduced species.
Very few things eat pill bugs either, I think. What eats a pill bug?
I don't know, you kids roll them though. Maybe
that's fun. I know. So from a management perspective, the Nature Center Prairie is divided into management units. We're talking a little bit about what we're doing for restoration. So you can look kind of through the map here and you can see that we have this thought out plan that we can plant, mow, burn, implement our management strategy throughout this larger prairie tract and talk about it intelligently because we have this plot map that gives us the ability to do that. Sometimes tallows grow separately, individually, in isolated colonies. We also target tallows with mechanical means such as the Chinese the chainsaw. But the cut stump of the Chinese tallow, if you do not use a labeled herbicide to spray on the stump, it will grow back with anger at you. Multiple trunks return. So it's critical that you use this type of a mechanical and chemical strategy to have success. Yes?
Just a point of curiosity. So you said there were a number of partners, and Dow Chemical was one of those at the bottom of the sign. Was that because they provided the chemicals to spray?
They did. That's right.
Strange bed part.
Yeah. Well, we do what we can, or maybe in this case, what we must. But they were a good partner because they donated about $10,000 worth of chemicals to do that. If those of you are not familiar with the nonprofit world, I could do a whole other segment about funding and funding challenges and the importance of partnerships. Another important part of our program is monitoring how prairies change over time in response to our management. Prairies are really poorly understood. If we could get all 10 of our greatest prairie experts to stand up here right now, we'd probably have about 8 strong differences of opinions on 10 different topics in prairies. So grasslands are evolving, and our understanding of grasslands and how to manage them is evolving. But one of the things that we do is we go into the prairie and look at these study sites. We have 32 transect lines. That's really just a study area where we go out and collect data. So what we're doing here is trying to see what plants are growing in this transect line. We have a vegetation data sheet. So our team of trained volunteers goes out into the prairie. They go into those 32 areas spring and fall, and they look for these indicator plants. Every plant tells us a story in nature. And for us particularly, I've already told you about a couple of those. Tallows, that's an important plant in prairies. So you'll notice one of the plants on this list is a Chinese tallow plant. Another one might have been some of those ice cream plants, the switchgrass and gamagrass. Those are what were the historically dominant grasses in the prairie. We look for trends of how those plants are changing in the prairie over time. So we've got almost 20 years worth of data from these transect lines now. Here's just one example, the Chinese tallow tree. Here's a graph that kind of shows you what our tallow populations have done. This is kind of a shotgun. It's hard to know exactly what's happened over the whole of the prairie, but this is what this graph has attempted to tell us, and there is a downward trend. Not as steep as the conservation director would like it, but there is a downward trend in prairie populations due to our management efforts. So the data collection in the transect lines gives us a scientific methodology to determine, are we doing the right thing? Are we achieving success? And if we're not, we need to adapt. We need to do something differently to try to make sure that tallows are decreasing in the prairie landscape. By contrast, gamagrass, one of those other prairie plants historically that we're trying to reestablish, we can look at that graph and see that it's slightly increasing. So we see that things are generally moving in the right direction, and that ability to capture the data through the transect lines gives us another tool in measuring. Yes?
Yes, Mark. I noticed it came up to zero. Was it
pretty close? Man, it was pretty close to zero. Yeah, it was pretty close to zero. Used to be in the I'll go back to the old days, you know, back when I was out there in the 80s or 90s. If we saw a eastern gamagrass plant in the prairie, it was cause for jubilation.
okay? So basically, you're bringing it back through just those plants that were there, or are you reseeding, or what?
I'll get there. And I need to get there in a hurry. I asked Wendy for 3 hours, but oh, look, this is a slide that you were just asking about, our native plant nursery. So the Nature Center manages a greenhouse. It manages a native plant nursery. We began, well, the greenhouse was built in the 1980s, and we have done a fair amount of plant propagation, but things really began to ramp up in the mid-1990s. We began to recognize the importance of introduction of prairie plants. We've had cultivated a team of who have become the local experts in prairie plant propagation. Tom Solomon will raise his hand, and I will tell him thank you again for all of his years of service at Armand Bayou Nature Center and now other places where we have taken the native plant nursery to what I would say is a new and somewhat unique level. That greenhouse enabled us initially to kind of formulate the native plant nursery around it, and what we're trying to do is bring back these native plants that were historically there. So we've talked about the plants as ice cream plants, right? They taste good to cows. We've talked about how those plants disappeared because of overgrazing efforts. But an interesting thing we haven't talked about is it turns out that the ice cream plants, if we could go back in time to 1500 and fly over the coastal prairie, when we looked down, there would have been a very short list of plant species that dominated the prairie surface. We call those dominant plants. Get it? They dominate the prairie surface. So you might say there were 6 or 10 or 12 species, but that eastern gamagrass, switchgrass, big blue stem, Indian grass, I could list a few more, but the list is short. Those were also the ice cream plants. The dominant grasses and the ice cream plants turned out to be the same thing. So when the overgrazing pressures happened, many of those most important dominant grasses disappeared. And that is often the answer to when a high school student looks at me and says, man, we're standing out in a field of grass. Why are we planting grass in a field of grass? So it turns out that we're bringing back that historical dominant plant balance of what it would have looked like if we had gone back in time. It's a major effort too. Tom will tell you. We grow about 10 to 15,000 1-gallon containers, and we bring high school students out into the prairie to install them. It's through our service learning program. We work with local high schools and colleges. They give us a couple of hours of labor. If we can get 100 students out there, we can plant 2,000 or 3,000 of those 1-gallon containers before lunch. So that's affecting change at the landscape level. Remember, we're gardening at the landscape level. Wendy's gardening a little bit smaller. Our efforts are a little bit bigger. But believe me, planting 3,000 plants before lunch of those 1-gallon containers, a lot of work. And then the students come back to the auditorium for the learning component, which is this lecture, essentially, providing that local ecosystem connection. Deer Park High School, right across from their main entrance, beautiful prairie wetland, filled with spider lilies. One of my favorite prairie plants. Big, fragrant, colorful, dramatic. It's about 2,000 of those planted along the Nature Center's entry road now. So really what we're doing is managing a living museum. Remember, going back in time, this is what Houston was prairie. But going forward in time, there are going to be very few of these places left. So we're collecting new elements to our living museum here through this type of process. Pasadena High School, go out into the field. You can see they're watering some of the plants here as they go into the ground. We have a big community-based event called Prairie Pandemonium. That means everybody comes from the neighborhood, I hope, and has lunch, little education, door prizes, T-shirts, that type of thing. So here's a snapshot of 1 year. I think I showed 2013 here. You can see we planted about 10,000 plants. You can see all the various schools. And it's really just the elite great schools that come, like University of Houston Clear Lake, that comes to participate in those programs. And let's pause for a question, if we have any, and then we'll watch another film strip. Yeah. Okay.
You studied less than 1% of prairies remain the historical prairies. Is that coastal prairies or all prairies?
Well, I know it's coastal prairies, but as far as nationally, I don't know that answer. How much?
It's tallgrass prairies.
Coastal tallgrass prairies?
No, just tallgrass prairies.
Just tallgrass prairies, okay. And then my second one is, do you mind if someone uses we have a native, I'm working on a very small, we want to talk landscape, it's 1,200 square feet of prairie that they've given me. Mind if we use the term prairie pandemonium on our next planting session?
Oh, man.
See, we could be part 2. It could be further.
That'd be better. Put 2.0 at the end of it and you're fine. Okay. All right, let's watch a film strip, because I'm running behind here.
Well, we're here today.
You full screen it?
The annual restoration event called Prairie Pandemonium. And the name of it is really very appropriate because we're working in the prairie, and what we're trying to do is bring back those original historic prairie plants that had disappeared over time. Grazing pressure, invasive species, a whole host of different things have contributed to the disappearance of a lot of the plants that are very important to its ecology.
Go back and forth across. All right. Whenever you find a hole, you let me know and I'll fill it in the map.
You got it.
Give it to them so our volunteers will come out here and plant it.
You got it. We've segregated ourselves into 4 separate sections, each with 750 plants and approximately 20 to 25 volunteers. The process is to take the plants, okay, that have already been incubated and nourished in these 1-gallon pots and to spread them out evenly within each section. Then we put the prairie plant into the ground, pack the dirt around it, give it a big smile, okay, and move on to the next hole. What you see around us here is the pandemonium part of it. We're trying to plant about 3,000 prairie plants in these 1-gallon containers before lunchtime. So it's taken almost a full year for us to grow this amount of plant material, and then in a very short time window it all gets planted in one day, prairie pandemonium.
Somewhere around 110 people are here right now, and so we're doing really, really great because it rained in the last couple of days. We didn't have to water with all this, and so we've been able to get, we were hoping to get 3,000 plants. We're already at 3,500 plants planted already. So it's great morning. So this is what we call IBCs. They hold food product, like some kind of corn oil, but huge quantities of it, and actually after they're used, we get companies around here to donate them to us, and then we hold water in them. So in the times when we had droughts or during the summer when we're planting out here, we fill them up with water, and then we go out and put about a gallon of water in every hole before we put the plant in there. because we had rain this week, and actually we had a whole bunch of it last night. The holes are very, very wet already, so we didn't have to have people carrying, 2 or 3 gallons. That's a lot of weight for people, and you have to go to every hole to carry it, so we were lucky. And that's part of the reason we're doing so well on plants today, is we didn't have to carry all that water to every hole.
We're trying to preserve a part of Texas and Pasadena's ecological heritage. This is like a living museum. Pasadena once was almost completely grasslands, or these coastal tallgrass prairies that you see around us. But interestingly, when we brought cattle in and put them in permanent fenced pastures, those cows repeatedly like to eat the same type of grass over and over. And cowboys call those grasses ice cream plants because they taste real sweet to the cows, and that's why they like to eat them, is because they taste better. But because of that intensive ongoing grazing pressure, the grasses ultimately are grazed out of existence, and over time they disappear. So that really is what restoration ecology is bringing back the natives. We're trying to bring back those grasses that used to be the main players in the prairie ecology, in addition to a whole host of wildflowers that have also disappeared.
We're putting in Big Blue, Little Blue, which we kind of call miscellaneous. We're putting in forbs.
Gamma grass, yellow Indian grass, and switchgrass. And the other 2 things we're planting, we have things called forbs, and they all prairie plants, except the other ones that flower.
And also a list of wildflowers that enhances the diversity of the prairie plant community. Armand Bayou Nature Center manages a native plant nursery. We have a greenhouse, we have a nursery area, so we also have a really dedicated team of volunteers that comes out every Friday. And that Friday volunteer team is called Prairie Friday. So those folks collect seeds, they dig up grasses from areas that are slated for development, neighborhood, strip center, area that's going to be disturbed. So they're collected from the local area. It takes 6 months or so for those plants to reach the beautiful state that you see in these pots where they're ready to go back in the ground. The other reason that it's important and why we're doing it is that these types of areas provide important ecosystem services to the community.
The good thing about prairie plants, the roots are 6 feet long. So the good thing about that is that when it rains, the water gets on the dirt and then it gets absorbed into the plants and it actually gets soaked into the ground. So it helps dampen flooding. Plants convert the bad stuff into good things. Cleans up the water, so when it does get into either the aquifers or gets run off into the ditches, into the bayous, it gets cleaned up, and so it's better for the bay. Better for the seafood we eat, the shrimp and the fish and the crabs.
It's also a great place for recreation. This is one of the few publicly accessible prairies in Texas. We have a prairie hiking trail so you can bring the family out. So a whole long list of benefits as to why it's important and why we're doing what we're doing.
All right, good teachers, you're getting it now. I tell you what I'm going to tell you, I tell you, and then I tell you what I told you, right? So, those grazing effects that once were accomplished through bison. We tried rotational grazing with cattle at the Nature Center, had very poor success, very difficult to manage a herd of cattle, more difficult to manage a herd of bison. Relatively easy to manage George Regman, relatively easy, especially on a tractor. So you can see this batwing mower that he's on here gives kind of a rough mimic of what those grazing animals would have done. Equally important, it helps to cut down those woody species, kind of sets back that successional progress of the trees and shrubs growing tall and dominating the plant community. I mentioned to you we use fire as a tool. It's called prescribed burning. Increasingly important all around the United States, not just ecologically, but prescribed burning also promotes public safety. Prescribed burning helps to minimize fuel loads, which hopefully helps to minimize catastrophic wildfires like the ones we saw in California. But a prescribed burn has 3 components to it. First of all, it happens in a predetermined area. We call it a burn unit. That means we know where the fire is going to begin, where it's going to end. That's particularly important in an urban area, isn't it? Otherwise, people get really nervous. We don't want wildfires around our homes. Another important element of the prescribed fire is that it only occurs during predetermined weather conditions. Wind has got to be just right. right speed, right direction, humidity's got to be just right. Otherwise, if the wind changes direction, the fire's behavior and rate of spread and travel becomes unpredictable. Fire boss doesn't want that. It makes me very nervous when you don't know where the fire is going to do. If it's blowing 50 miles an hour, difficult to control it. So we have a burn plan that tells us exactly what we need to do to have a safe prescribed burn in that unit. And the third and final element to a prescribed burn is that we're trying to achieve an ecological goal. We're trying to do something with the fire. It's a lot of fun, but we're not out there because it's fun. We're actually trying to achieve an ecological goal. And as this burn history graph indicates, as land managers are successful, as we begin to remove tallow forests about 1996, notice this increased trend in need for management, in need for burning. So the dilemma is, the more successful you are over time restoring prairies, the harder the job becomes because there's more of it that needs to be done. And we are one of the longest burn entities in Texas. We lit our first fire in 1979. We go out and walk around the edge of this burn unit with the drip torch. It drips this flaming stream of fuel, igniting the flames through the prairie. You can see the hot part of that fire is focused on the tallow trunk and tree limb. The short part of the answer with fire is that the intense heat that it generates is focused on the trunks and trees above the ground, and woody trees and shrubs are not well fire adapted. Typically it at least top kills trees and shrubs. Oftentimes it completely kills trees and shrubs. So that's the real benefit. As the trees and shrubs are impacted and declined through the heat generated from this disturbance, they are either killed or suppressed because of these extremely high temperatures that can be generated as part of the fire's effects. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. Very little survives above the ground, even in the grass community. And immediately after the fire has passed, if it's your first burn, you think, oh my God, what have we done to this landscape? Because it looks lunar. It looks like every living thing has been killed. But it turns out that the suppression of woody plants is not the only benefit that fire has in grassland landscapes. This blackened soil surface initially kills many of the microbes in the soil, particularly the bacteria populations. It turns out that those bacteria play a critical role in the fixing of nitrogen in the soil. If you're a plant biologist, even if you're not, you go to the hardware store and buy a bag of fertilizer, those three numbers on the front of a bag of fertilizer are the ratio between nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen first. It's a critical element in the growth of plants. When you don't have enough of it, plants don't grow well. But it turns out that bacteria are one of the primary ways that nitrogen gets fixed in prairie soils. Nitrogen in our atmosphere. Over 70% of the air we're breathing is nitrogen, and these bacteria, as nitrogen-fixing bacteria, pull that nitrogen out of the air and they fix it in the soil. And that promotes a very verdant, lush growth in the post-burn environment. So, as these grasses are located underground, remember it's an upside-down plant community. Remember most of the heat is up here. So these fire-adapted plants, that's what we refer to a prairie grass or wildflower as, is fire adapted, surrounded by wet soil, an excellent insulator. Notice its growth tissue is at or below the soil surface under the heat of the fire. These plants have either had to evolve these growth strategies to escape that intense heat and flourish, or else they flash off into the environment and disappear. And this is why the native peoples found it so valuable to use as a tool. When the plant community flourishes, so do the animals. This lush green growth, very attractive to wildlife in the post-burn environment. Let me see. I don't know if I want to run 10 minutes over or not. I don't know. Do you guys want to watch fire, or should I try to wrap up, Wendy? I probably ought to try to wrap up. Let me keep going. And I'm getting close. I'm going to be about 5 minutes over here. So here's a picture of the Nature Center Prairie. You can see the signatures of our different management activities. You can see a burn unit. You can see a mow unit. You can see an area that's been left untouched or unmanaged. So when you look at this, what you see is a habitat mosaic. You see a patchwork of different landscapes. And it turns out that those are critical to supporting wildlife, different forms of wildlife, and helping to promote a diversity of wildlife in our prairie plant community. I'll give you just a couple of brief examples. If you're a bird watcher, you may know that the snipe is one of the longest distance migrants that comes to our area. Snipe are winter birds on the Texas coast. They fly about 3,500 miles to get here. And they're looking for this. They're looking for exposed, soft, moist soil so that they can probe down into the mud with that nerve-rich bill ending and feel for invertebrates, worms, other animals that are part of their diet. This burn unit gives them access to feeding habitat. See lots of snipe in our post-burn areas in a winter unit. Down here, the mow unit mimics what the bison would have done. If you're a browsing, grazing animal, a rabbit, a deer, it's a great place to find green growth as part of your diet. Here, where the prairie has been untouched, lots of wintering songbirds like sparrows and wrens and prairie birds flock to the Texas coast because they don't want to be in Massachusetts either. Who wants to be in Massachusetts? And they spend the winter on the Texas coast. This is cover habitat for those birds. This is feeding habitat because of last year's seeds still clinging. So this patchwork of habitat mosaic enables us to support a greater diversity of life in a relatively small prairie. But it also turns out, remember we said that these three ecosystems were a snapshot in time. If we could go back in time, it's what all of the upper Texas coast would have looked like. This mosaic, that's also true. If we could go back in time to 1500, huge areas would have been burned. Big wildfires sweeping the landscape. That Harris County-sized herd of bison would have traveled far and wide, leaving these post-grazing effects down here. Big areas would have also been left untouched, as we see here. But today, in order to accomplish this, it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of money. This is an annual management plan or typical regime that we might accomplish here. Here it is on a map. You can see in 1 year what we mowed, what we burned, what we planted, what we controlled Chinese tallows on. So there's the gardening at the landscape level. And this is why it's important. It's important because only 1% of coastal prairie still survives. Habitat loss is one of the biggest ecological threats that we face worldwide. And increasingly our data tells us, particularly Audubon bird census data, tells us that grassland birds are some of the most rapidly declining populations in North America. In fact, some of their most recent data indicates that these species, which I saw in my youth growing up on Prairie Street in Pasadena, Texas, they were everywhere, all around me. Shrikes, meadowlarks, sparrows. These birds have declined by 80% in the last 40 years, according to that Audubon data. And remember, that's about the time that I was running around in those fields as a youngster to now. And this is the poster child. Atwater's prairie chicken may be, well, I'm sure is one of the rarest birds on earth. I talked to the refuge manager, Terry Rosignol, last year. We were working on one of those Bayou City eco-almanacs. Last year, 40 Atwater's prairie chickens in the wild. If it weren't for the captive breeding programs of the Houston Zoo and the other partners helping to provide birds to bring back into the wild, they almost certainly would be completely gone. So here's an acronym I want you to remember. All these concepts, as far as ecologically, what the impacts have been to prairies and everywhere else, just remember the word hippo, because these are really some of the biggest threats that we're facing. Habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, human population, especially in our area, also globally, and hunting still exists as a problem, overhunting, unregulated hunting worldwide. We don't want what left becomes part of a ghost of the past here. Finally, the closing thought today, prairies are a people-dependent ecosystem. Think about an ecosystem that can't survive without people. A whole ecosystem. We've talked about ecologically, historically, how prairies occurred with naturally occurring fires sweeping the landscape. We've talked about the bison. But today, unless people actively manage prairies, unless they implement these types of management strategies, grasslands everywhere ultimately are converted into shrublands and forests. So the work that we do to educate the next generation, the volunteers that help support all of these various programs in our area, without those types of activities and efforts, prairies would be gone. I was going to show one more YouTube if I had time, but I don't. So, yeah, you want to look at that? Okay. Oh no, we can't read it. Coastal prairie once existed as the dominant feature in the Texas landscape. Common yellowthroat is the main one. I think it's a sparrow, but I'm terrible with sparrows. All right, that's it for me unless there's a question. Okay, thank you.